In a televised broadcast on November 15th, the military of Zimbabwe announced that President Robert Mugabe had been put under house arrest. The spokesman said that the army was targeting criminal elements within the ruling party and denied that the operation was a plot to overthrow the government. Yet, despite the assurance, the military takeover is not a popular uprising against tyranny. In fact, the event bears all the signs of a coup. Welcome to Caspian Report, narrated by Brody and written by Shervan. At dawn on Wednesday, Zimbabwean troops led by General Chiwenga of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces mobilized across the capital and suspended the government of Mugabe. The military takeover comes 2 days after General Chiwenga had threatened to step in if the ongoing purge within the ruling party continued. The perpetrators of the coup were concerned about their diminishing relevance within the ruling party and their access to critical resources, which included lucrative land ownership and influence in state-owned companies. In recent weeks, political divisions in Zimbabwe had been growing since the dismissal of Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, who represented the military faction. In this framework, the military coup is a preemptive action to preserve the military's faction's privileges. As of this writing, the military takeover had been remarkably calm, and most civilians have been able to continue with their daily routines. That said, residents are unsure whether to celebrate the ousting of the president or brace themselves for a new generation of dictators. Either way, 37 years of Mugabe's reign is not easily cast off. In the 1980s, following the guerrilla war that ended the apartheid state of Rhodesia, Mugabe led Zimbabwe to independence. Initially, there were hopes that he would prove to be a democratic leader, but upon taking power, Mugabe's policies focused on ethnic rivalries. The president was a member of the Shona ethnic group, while Joshua Nkomo, who represented the main opposition, was of the Ndebele people. What's more is that most of the agriculturally productive land was owned by a small white minority. In the first decade after independence, Mugabe moved to crush his rival, in which between 10,000 and 20,000 people were massacred. By 1993, Mugabe moved against the white minority. He encouraged military commanders to seize land that was owned by the white minority without compensation. For his actions, Mugabe gained the admiration of the Zimbabwean people, but his policies were detrimental to relations with the West. Either way, in a short span of time, Mugabe had destroyed Zimbabwe's agricultural sector. He turned the breadbasket of Africa into a poverty-stricken country crippled by a dysfunctional economy. As Mugabe distanced himself from the West, relations with China improved to such extent that Chinese companies gained control over the mining industry in Zimbabwe. Beginning in 2001, the United States imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe for Mugabe's authoritarian rule. However, Washington's policy only made Zimbabwe's government even more anti-Western. As a result, diplomatic and economic relations with China skyrocketed. What's more is that as Mugabe became isolated in the international arena, he surrounded himself with political loyalists. Anyone who disagreed was eliminated from the ruling party. Soon afterwards, Mugabe increasingly resorted to violence and intimidation to maintain his hold on power. Today, Mugabe's presidency is tainted with abuse of power, violations of human rights, as well as corruption and nepotism. The ruling party, the ZANU-PF, has become synonymous with the government, and Zimbabwe emerged as a one-party state. As Mugabe aged, he became even more ruthless, and in recent years, he also became dependent on his wife Grace, who is 40 years his junior. Until a few years ago, Grace was not considered a contender for the presidency, but starting in 2014, she instigated the dismissal of then Vice President Joyce Mujuru. Following this, the First Lady designed a new faction within the ruling party, which became known as the G40. The youth and the women's wing of ZANU-PF rallied behind the G40. These developments, however, greatly aggravated the military faction and the older generation of the ZANU-PF, which was headed by former Vice President Mnangagwa. Many consider the 75-year-old Mnangagwa, who was a veteran of the Independence War and served as the Minister of State, Justice, and Defense, as the most likely successor to the 93-year-old Mugabe. However, in August 2017, Mnangagwa was rushed to a hospital in South Africa after he fell ill during a rally. Mnangagwa indicated that he had been poisoned, and 2 months later, the president demoted him from Ministry of Justice to oversee the insignificant tourism sector of Zimbabwe. At the same time, Mnangagwa's allies, which included several senior military leaders, were dismissed by the president. Finally, on November 6th, Mugabe sacked Mnangagwa from office for lack of loyalty and respect, as well as allegations of witchcraft. As Mnangagwa fled to South Africa, Mugabe signaled that he was siding with his wife. These sudden alterations came shortly ahead of the planned Congress of the ZANU-PF in mid-December. So, many top officials of the ruling party speculated that the First Lady was about to be promoted to the Vice President. However, Mnangagwa's dismissal turned out to be the final straw for the military faction and the old guard of the ruling party, including for General Chiwenga of the Defense Forces, who orchestrated the recent coup. Both Grace's G40 and Mnangagwa's allies have sinister reputations, and there are no significant policy differences between the two. It mostly revolves around the secession of Mugabe. Until the coup, the First Lady appeared to have eliminated her rivals. Yet, in alienating so many officials from the ruling party, Grace weakened her hold. In this context, the recent military intervention is the result of Mugabe's secession design, in which he relegated Mnangagwa and backed Grace against the wishes of the military and older generation of the ruling party. That said, the coup comes at a time when Zimbabwe is still struggling with several economic issues. The most well-known financial crisis is the country's hyperinflation, which peaked at nearly 80 billion% in 2008. Since then, the Zimbabwean government has left no choice but to abandon the national currency in favor of the United States dollar. But more recently, in 2016, the government in Harare introduced bond notes into the economy and stated that these were equal to the dollar. However, the parallel currency is backed by a controversial loan from the African Export-Import Bank. So, many are concerned that the latest measure will inflame another period of hyperinflation. As bad as this sounds, Zimbabwe's finances are further complicated by its liquidity crisis. Since the government uses the US dollar as the de facto currency as a remedy for the hyperinflation, it faces a shortage of cash. This liquidity crisis was further aggravated in 2016, when a severe regional drought in the agricultural sector and lower global mineral prices reduced the government's income. The result is that Zimbabwe is running out of cash and the government is still struggling to pay its civil servants, which makes up for the majority of formal economy. Since the start of the liquidity crisis, salary payments to various agencies, including the armed forces, have been frequently delayed. Usually, an authoritarian government ensures the loyalty of its peers by means of financial coercion, meaning, as Zimbabwe's financial crisis endures with no resolution on the horizon, the scarcity of wealth will continue to force the elites to turn against one another. All things considered, Mugabe's presidency as we know it is over. Whoever succeeds him will have to design a transitional government that includes members of the political opposition, but also preserves the ruling party's status quo and implements economic reforms. The final point is especially important given the fact that Zimbabweans are younger than 20 years, and thus consider the current economic prospects more pressing than the memory of the fight for independence and the reputation of the ruling party. This was a Caspian Report, narrated by Brody and written by Shervan. Special thanks to our contributors on Patreon for giving us the means to produce reports such as these. If you want to learn more, visit patreon.com/Caspian Report. For now, thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next report.